The war had ended. The noise of battle faded into the distance, replaced by parades, music, and tears of relief. Across America, the air shimmered with the promise of peace. But for thousands of black soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific, peace never truly arrived. They had left their homes believing that service to the flag would finally earn them the respect long denied. Yet, when they came back, something unexpected awaited them: silence. Ships arrived full, but rosters were incomplete. Names appeared on arrival lists, then vanished from official records days later. Families waited for telegrams that never came. The government said it was administrative confusion, the natural chaos of demobilization. But in many homes, the explanation rang hollow. How could so many men, disciplined and documented, disappear in a time of supposed transparency? Their absence was not dramatic, not loud. It crept in like fog, gradual, quiet, and complete. And as the nation celebrated victory, their stories slipped quietly out of history's frame. Victory had many faces. Some were simply erased. Behind the glory of the Allied triumph lay a divided army. Black soldiers were organized into segregated units, their ranks labeled colored, their roles limited, their recognition restricted. They built roads through forests, laid rails across battlefields, loaded endless supplies into ships, and maintained the machines that carried freedom forward. Their work sustained the war effort, but their presence was often invisible. When official reports listed troop movements, segregated units were grouped under general codes, not names. It made administration easier, and, perhaps unintentionally, made erasure easier too. When victory came, many of these units were dissolved within days. Files were merged, reassigned, or simply marked inactive. The system that had divided them now quietly absorbed their existence into blank pages. At first, it seemed like a clerical oversight, but as researchers decades later compared the surviving rosters, something strange appeared. Patterns of missing records clustered around certain bases, certain units, certain states. In those patterns lay a question too troubling to ignore. Was this disappearance accidental or engineered? The end of the war launched one of the largest troop movements in history. Ships crossed the Atlantic and Pacific every week, carrying weary soldiers home. Crowds gathered at ports, waving flags, holding signs that read, "Welcome home, heroes." But not every hero disembarked. The Army said some were delayed overseas. Others were awaiting reassignment. But these explanations rarely aligned with the testimonies of those who had served beside them. Some ship manifests didn't match departure lists. Entire groups of soldiers vanished between European ports and American shores. In New York, officials cited confusion of personnel data. Yet, strangely, similar inconsistencies appeared in Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia. Rumors began to spread among the ranks. Whispers of secondary processing, of southern ports used for quiet transfers. Some said it was to prevent overcrowding in major cities. Others suspected a more deliberate intent. At night, convoys left the docks carrying soldiers inland, far from reporters and reunions. When families asked where their loved ones were, no one could say for certain. Only the silence knew. In the months after the war, the southern United States became dotted with what the Army called transitional installations. These were sites where returning soldiers were documented, medically screened, and prepared for reintegration. At least that was the official story. But eyewitnesses told another tale. Locals near the edges of small towns in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas described fenced compounds surrounded by guards. Truck convoys arrived at dusk and left before dawn. Some said they heard voices, marching orders, roll calls, the echo of boots, that stopped abruptly one day and never resumed. These camps weren't listed in public directories, nor were they mentioned in post-war briefings. Later, a few documents surfaced, referring to holding centers for deferred personnel. No explanation accompanied the term, and no complete list of these centers has ever been found. Historians speculate that they were used to process soldiers who faced administrative or disciplinary review. But what review could last for years, or decades, without record, Perhaps the truth wasn't about punishment. Perhaps it was about control, a way to manage a population whose courage threatened the order of the time. Texas holds a strange place in this mystery. During the war, it was the beating heart of America's military training network. Vast stretches of land became camps, bases, and depots. When peace came, many of these installations closed, but some never truly did. In Brazoria County, old residents still speak of convoys that passed through long after the war's end, lines of trucks carrying soldiers in faded uniforms. They recall searchlights sweeping through the trees and guards stationed along forgotten roads. Nearby, ranchers found ration cans, empty logbooks, and rusted badges scattered in fields that were supposed to be empty. Decades later, aerial surveys revealed rectangular foundations hidden under wild grass, identical in layout to known wartime barracks. The Army denied any knowledge, calling them agricultural storage facilities. Yet no records of transfer exist in county archives. Some researchers believe these sites were temporary reassignment centers, a phrase that appears in fragmented documents. But if temporary, why did they last for years? And why were the names of those processed there never written down? If history is written in ink, then erasure begins in fire. In the years following the war, archivists began noticing that certain documents, those related to segregated units, were incomplete, inconsistent, or missing entirely. When questions arose, explanations followed. Misplaced forms, accidental destruction, administrative reshuffling. Yet the gaps formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Whole units seemed to dissolve not just from duty, but from memory itself. Each missing folder carried the weight of men whose existence was now a rumor. Then came the 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center, a blaze that consumed millions of Army files. Among them were countless records belonging to black veterans. The government called it an accident. Historians called it the second burial. Those who tried to reconstruct the archives discovered that some files had already been removed before the fire began. It was as if the paper trail had been cleared long before the flames arrived. The war had produced a generation of men who had seen the world, men who had served beside allies who did not see them as lesser. When they returned, they brought with them not only experience, but expectation. For some, that was the real threat. America was not yet ready to reconcile the ideals it had preached abroad with the inequalities it upheld at home. Officials feared unrest, describing returning black veterans as highly impressionable, difficult to reintegrate, or susceptible to agitation. It was the language of anxiety disguised as order. Across the South, veterans' associations were monitored quietly by local law enforcement. Some gatherings were denied permits, others faced unexplained closures. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Courage was welcome overseas, but silence was expected at home. The same discipline that had built victory now built invisibility. While the nation celebrated its triumph, stories of disappearance rarely made it to print. Major newspapers focused on victory parades, reconstruction, and the optimism of a new era. But in smaller communities, particularly in the South, questions lingered. Black-owned papers attempted to investigate. Reporters collected testimonies, traced names, and followed trails that led to closed doors. Some editors received anonymous letters urging them to let the past rest. Funding quietly disappeared. Advertisers withdrew. Subscriptions dropped overnight. A few articles did reach publication. Small columns buried beneath stories of celebration. They spoke of soldiers unaccounted for, families still waiting. Then the coverage stopped. Entire series vanished from archives without explanation. It wasn't censorship through confrontation, but through neglect, silence that grew until it became accepted truth. When truth is too heavy, it is often buried under the weight of convenience. Time has a way of uncovering what the past tries to hide. Decades later, aerial surveys and declassified maps revealed faint outlines scattered across the southern landscape, isolated compounds, forgotten by most. Locals had always spoken of them. They remembered columns of men in uniform, guarded gates, and movements at night. Yet none of these places appeared in official military records. Researchers comparing wartime blueprints to post-war maps found identical structures that were simply renamed or unlisted. When asked, the Department of Defense described them as temporary logistic zones. But why were they fenced? Why did they have barracks, mess halls, and restricted access? In one Texas county, old residents recalled hearing songs at dusk, deep, rhythmic, carried by the wind from a direction where no one was supposed to be. Whether those echoes were memory or imagination, no one could say. But the silence surrounding them speaks of something too structured to be coincidence. Sometimes disappearance requires no violence at all, only paper. Many black soldiers returned home only to find their records incomplete, their discharges delayed, their benefits denied. A missing signature, a misfiled document, or a lost number was enough to erase a life of service. Without the right form, one could not prove rank, injury, or even participation. For the state, they became ghosts. Present, yet officially absent. Inquiries led to confusion. Confusion led to exhaustion. Families eventually stopped asking. Veterans who pressed further were told their cases would be reviewed pending verification. Verification that no longer existed. In a nation built on paperwork, a missing page can close an entire life story. And as years passed, absence became official. Some historians now call it a paper war, one that rewrote reality not through conflict but through quiet omission. Across small towns and big cities alike, porches turned into waiting stations. Mothers placed photographs on mantels beside candles that burned long into the night. Letters stopped arriving, yet the hope did not. Some families wrote weekly to the Department of War, pleading for clarity. The replies were coldly consistent. No record found. But absence is not the same as closure. For some, it became a lifetime of unanswered questions. Folded letters, worn uniforms kept in cedar chests, and prayers whispered into the wind. Community groups began compiling their own lists of the missing. Church leaders, school teachers, and neighbors pooled information, tracing what little evidence they could find. But each search led to the same bureaucratic wall. Missing files, unsigned forms, vanished archives. In time, the fog of uncertainty grew thicker, swallowing facts, dates, and names alike. And through that fog, the nation moved forward, leaving behind those who had already been left behind once before. In the late 1990s, declassified materials hinted at a name few had ever heard before: Operation Black Silence. The files were fragmented, heavily redacted, with more black ink than words. What could be read suggested an internal post-war initiative, not a battlefield operation, but an administrative one. It spoke of containment, reintegration challenges, and potential disruptions. Nowhere did it explain what those terms meant. Historians speculate that it referred to efforts to manage returning soldiers considered politically sensitive. These were veterans who had seen equality abroad and might have demanded it at home. If so, the goal was not physical restraint, but social invisibility, to keep them quiet, dispersed, and forgotten. Soon after these fragments were discovered, the files were reclassified. Even their catalog numbers disappeared. The phrase "Black Silence" became more than a title. It became the story itself. Decades passed before a few survivors dared to speak. In community halls, at reunions, and in small interviews, their memories resurfaced like fragments from a dream. They recalled being told to report for extended service, only to find themselves reassigned to unknown facilities. Others spoke of being transferred without explanation, waiting months for orders that never came. When they were finally released, their paperwork bore incorrect unit numbers, making their service untraceable. Some described long nights in quiet compounds, surrounded by men who felt forgotten but still held their dignity. Their testimonies were calm, measured, and deeply human. Yet when journalists approached official agencies for confirmation, doors closed once again. Records couldn't be found. Officers couldn't recall details, and memories faded under the weight of time. Still, these men's words carried an unmistakable truth, that silence itself can be a weapon, one that lasts longer than war. Today, the search continues in university archives, family attics, and forgotten government warehouses. Genealogists work from fragments, a payroll entry here, a transport log there. Digital reconstruction projects attempt to rebuild entire rosters from surviving scraps of data. Each rediscovered name becomes a small act of restoration, a light against the long night of forgetting. Local historians in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia have uncovered remnants of military facilities once listed under different purposes: agricultural storage, training extensions, supply stations. Beneath the surface, patterns emerge: consistent locations, overlapping dates, and units that were never officially deactivated. Every clue deepens the mystery instead of solving it. Because for every answer found, two more questions rise. Where did these men go, and why did the system seem designed to forget them? 8 decades later, the mystery endures, not because it cannot be solved, but because it was never meant to be. The faces of the missing live on only in grainy photographs, in the careful handwriting of mothers, and in the whispers of small-town memories. Their absence is not empty. It is full of meaning, a silence that hums beneath the surface of American history. To some, they are forgotten soldiers. To others, they are symbols of a truth too uncomfortable to face. Across the South, the land still holds its secrets. Old roads cut through forests where foundations hide beneath the soil. Every unearthed artifact, a tag, a button, a piece of correspondence, carries the same quiet question: what happens when a nation wins a war but loses its conscience? These men were promised that courage would bring them home, yet many never found that home again, not because they vanished, but because memory turned away. History, as it turns out, does not disappear. It waits, in the dust of archives, in the silence of fields, in the stories that refuse to die. And as each fragment of truth is uncovered, the echoes grow louder, asking us to listen at last. History doesn't vanish. It gets buried. Subscribe for more Forgotten Frontiers.